yes, the plight of natives was bleak as Canada entered the 20th century. In the West, in Western Canada, natives and the Métis became increasingly marginalized in the aftermath of the Rebellion of 1885. From the time of Confederation to the 1920s, the Canadian Indian population was in decline. Looking at the numbers, they were dropping from the point of Confederation up into the early 1920s. In 1915, the Indian population was about 100,000. In the early 1930s, however, the population of Native people began to rise. With the Indian population growing as opposed to declining, Indian policies were beginning to appear outdated. And up to this point, a lot of the policies were, hinting or reflecting on the idea that, the natives were declining. But now we see a turnabout, and the policies don't seem to be reflective of this. Now, in the past, some governmental officials had assumed increasing marginalization and eventually the disappearance of natives. Now that Indian numbers are on the rise, more money, some argued, was needed for government programs. With the rise of the First Nations population, I don't often use that term, but it's a very popular one in Canadian scholarship, not so in American scholarship, but same thing when I refer to First Nations, for talking natives, Aboriginals, Indians. With the rise of the population, there were signs of an emerging Native political movement. In the 1930s and 1940s, new organizations were formed, such as, here's one, the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia. That was formed in 1931. The Native Brotherhood of British Columbia. Alberta had one too. The Indian Association of Alberta. That was 1939. Saskatchewan had its own new organization called the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians. The Federation of Saskatchewan Indians, that came during the war, that was 1944. Now, according to one historian, World War II had a significant impact on Canadian Indian policy. Canadians and the Allies had fought against a German Nazi regime that was racist, but the Canadian authorities in charge of Indian policy often were guided by racist assumptions. We see in Canadian Indian policy more or less assuming that Indians were morally and economically inferior. So World War II then, with Hitler, the issue of racism, the horrible things that were happening to the Jews, And it got more people thinking about what was happening domestically, what was happening in Canada. And unfortunately, there were assumptions by some that the natives were morally and economically inferior. Now, one might make an argument that they were behind economically, because again, not everyone is embracing Western civilization, the Western idea of, free market economics. And so there are some within the community that are pursuing economic ventures that are not necessarily that beneficial. But to assume that natives were morally inferior, that obviously is problematic. That's concerning. With the rise of social science, there was a better understanding of Aboriginal life. More importantly, with this better understanding, it was clear that Canadian treatment of natives wasn't always honorable. Now, some apologists would say, yes, mistakes were made, but the government had good intentions. They had noble intentions. It's just as the process was carried out, it was not done so in a manner that was, it's a very appreciative. Now, getting back to the war, there was a realization that a significant number of natives had volunteered for military service during World War II. And with this, a number of groups began to point out what they saw was injustice that many Native people had to suffer because of the government being insensitive. Now, to summarize, attitudes towards the Indians began to change because social scientists argued against race theory, and two, approximately 3,000 natives had volunteered and fought for the Allies. Despite a greater public awareness and concern for the treatment of Native peoples, Canadian politicians in the post-war period continued to uphold a policy of assimilation. Now, the Department of Indian Affairs did interfere less with Native life. After 1951, under a revised Indian Act, the Department of Indian Affairs slowly gave band councils increased powers. Nonetheless, Indian integration into the greater Canadian community was still the primary objective of Canadian authorities. And for the most part, this was not something nefarious. They truly believed that in the long run, it was best that natives adopted more embrace the idea of Western civilization, embrace Western ways, be part of a free market economy, and some of them did. Yeah. I mean, we even see from our reading how some natives would farm and sell things to their neighbors. The Canadian government just did not see a future for Native people if they insisted on fishing, trapping, particularly trapping, hunting as their main activities for economic security. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a significant increase in exploration of natural resources. The resource-based boom resulted in greater contact between natives and non-native Canadians. Mining, hydroelectric, and oil ventures in the northern regions were interrupting some of the natives' traditional way of life. Now again, the position of the Canadian government was that it rejected Aboriginal hunting in the North as a viable economic activity. And they wanted to integrate the native peoples into the broader Canadian society. And there were various ways they attempted to do this. They wanted to model Western concepts of land ownership, for example. And this is something that was played out in different regions of the North, including the Yukon. With Yukon natives, there was going to be trap line registration. There were oil and gas leases. There were staking out of hundreds of new mineral claims. And these signaled the entrenchment of Canadian methods of land ownership. Now, this is nothing new, of course, to Canadians, but for Northerners who up to this point had not had much contact with non-natives, non-native or whites, primarily whites, not having much contact with white Canadians, you know, they had pretty much carried on their traditional way of life and you know, pretty much were left alone. But now, with, you know, the natural resources, with oil, with minerals, there's a greater presence of whites in these northern regions. And the whites, the Canadian government wanted to sort of model Western values and hoped that natives would embrace these values. But it wasn't easy. There's a lot of emotional rhetoric out there on how various natives were upset with the new system. And I have a quote here from a native from Whitehorse. And this is what this native declared. This was my father's land and his father's before the white man came. We didn't ask you to come. Once I had a cabin in Whitehorse. The police said it was on government land. They tore it down. They laughed. That was my home. So we get all kinds of very emotional commentary by natives. For the first time, having direct contact with white Canadians, with the government. The burst of economic activity in the northern regions after World War II, in the eyes of Native activists, was a significant threat to Indian traditional use of the land. For the first time ever, they had to respect Western claims to the land and refrain from hunting and using the land as they sought a living. Now, into the 1960s, more and more non-Native Canadians began to be concerned about the plight of natives. Now, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau was committed to popular participation in policy making, but he did not want to recognize group rights. Group rights. Determined to defeat the claims of French Canadian nationalists for special status in Quebec, Trudeau avoided making any concessions that recognize racial and ethnic groups in legislative and constitutional proceedings. In 1969, after 1 year in office, Trudeau's administration, the Liberal administration, released its white paper on Indian policy. Now, the future Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien, he was before most of your time, but does anyone recognize the name Jean Chrétien? You've heard that name? Yes. He was the Indian Affairs Minister. And he introduced the Statement of the Government on Indian Policy. That was what it was referred to. Capital S, Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy, 1969. Now, ironically, the Liberals' proposal, which sought to eliminate Indian status, contributed greatly to the resurgence of Native politics. Now I'll get into the details of this white paper. So, what we have here is this white paper. What did it propose? One, to release the federal government of its commitments by revoking Indian status. Two, and this is a big one, to abolish the Department of Indian Affairs in 5 years. 3, provinces to take greater control of Indian responsibilities. It's a remarkable document. The white paper reflected Trudeau's ideas of individualism. In other words, the white paper correlated with this idea of not recognizing ethnic and racial groups as collectivities. Well, how did it go over? What do you guys think? You think this went over well? You're shaking your head, you're correct. It did not go over well because we still have the department, more modern name. The white paper was not what Native leaders wanted. They wanted economic and social recovery without losing their identity. The white paper proposed the extinction of their separate status. And thus the white paper galvanized Natives to action. And the protest was very strong. Native activists were saying, we don't have true dialogue with the government. This is a dialogue of the deaf. That was their way of presenting it. A dialogue of the deaf. And so the white paper gave Native peoples a common enemy against which to mobilize. And this is really important because when you have so many different Native bands, different Native groups, there's fragmentation, there's competing interests. But now they have a common enemy, something they can focus on. The Cree president of the Indian Association of Alberta declared that the Canadian government was saying that, quote, the only good Indian is a non-Indian. Alberta Indians introduced their own Citizens Plus red paper. And that red is spelled R-E-D. So they're not beating around the bush with their, in essence, defining what they see as the word white. They use red. Citizens Plus red paper. And this paper claimed that Indians were a distinct group who had special rights. John Chrétien, in the eyes of these Native activists, was a liar. Now, Native leaders began to work through the National Indian Brotherhood. This is a more national group, the National Indian Brotherhood, to fight the proposals of the Liberals. Soon it was clear to others, meaning non-natives, that there had been a lack of consultation in the months leading up to the release of the white paper. Now, at first, obviously, Chrétien is going to defend the paper, the policy. But the political pressure was too significant. So within a year, the Liberals were forced to back down and withdraw the white paper. Now, Natives did make some headway. One example was in 1973. In that year, the federal government agreed to Native demands to transfer control and funding of education to Indian bands. The bands designed their own curriculum and began to train and hire their own teachers. Also, in the aftermath of the white paper, the case of self-government was advanced by Indian organizations. But there were problems with this proposal, with this goal of having Native self-government. For many non-natives, Indian self-government was in conflict with the liberal democratic values of the majority population. That's small liberal, I'm referring. Liberal democratic values. Many Canadians rejected the idea of special treatment for a particular group. They saw society as a collection of individuals who should be treated equally regardless of their race or language. So that was one problem that Natives had who wanted self-government. The second issue was that Indian communities required economic stability. In order for Natives to have self-government that's going to work, there had to be financial resources to support this.